This morning, you felt it. A scratchy throat, maybe the start of a headache. So you opened the medicine cabinet, grabbed a pill, swallowed it with water, and got on with your day. You didn't think twice about it. But that small white tablet contains something your ancestors would have genuinely killed for. And the story of how humans survived sickness before that pill ever existed is stranger, darker, and far more remarkable than anything you were taught in school. Getting sick 50,000 years ago wasn't just unpleasant. It was, more often than not, a death sentence, unless your tribe actively did something about it. And what they actually did will change how you look at modern medicine for good. Start with something that sounds almost impossible. In 2017, researchers excavating a burial site at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq made a discovery that reshaped what we understand about Neanderthals, our ancient human relatives who lived across Europe and Asia until roughly 40,000 years ago. They found the remains of a man who'd lived to somewhere between 40 and 50 years old, genuinely old age by Neanderthal standards. But what stunned researchers wasn't his age. It was the state of his skeleton. His right arm had been amputated. He was partially blind. He had severe arthritis throughout his spine and joints. This was a man who could not have hunted, could not have gathered food. By every reasonable measure of Stone Age survival, he should have died decades earlier than he did. Instead, his community fed him, cared for him, and protected him for years. People caring for one another like this is the oldest evidence of healthcare we have on Earth. Caring for the sick didn't begin with hospitals. It began around a fire, roughly 60,000 years ago. But care wasn't the only tool available to them. They had plants. Long before anyone understood bacteria, viruses, or inflammation as concepts, humans were learning. Through trial and error, careful observation, and no small number of deaths. Exactly which plants made you feel better and which ones killed you outright. That knowledge is written directly into the archaeological record. Ötzi the Iceman, the 5300-year-old mummy found frozen in the Alps, was carrying a small medical kit at the time of his death. Inside it, 2 pieces of birch, polypore mushroom strung on a leather cord. For years, researchers weren't sure why. Then, they actually analyzed the mushroom and found it contains compounds with genuine antibiotic and anti-inflammatory properties. Ötzi also happened to be suffering from intestinal parasites, and modern studies have shown that same mushroom has measurable antiparasitic effects. He wasn't carrying it as decoration, he was treating himself. And Ötzi, at 5,300 years old, is relatively recent in this story. The relationship between humans and medicinal plants stretches back much further. Archaeologists studying ancient dental plaque from Neanderthal remains at a site called El Sidrón in Spain found traces of plants with 0 nutritional value. Among them, yarrow and groundsel, both with well-documented medicinal properties. The Neanderthals weren't eating these for calories. They were eating them because they worked, and this dates back at least 50,000 years. Then there's willow bark. Humans have been chewing it for at least 3,500 years, documented directly in ancient Egyptian medical papyri. The active compound in willow bark is called salicin, which your body converts into salicylic acid. In 1897, chemists at Bayer finally synthesized a stable, purified version of that same compound and called it aspirin. The pill sitting in your medicine cabinet is, quite literally, the same molecule your ancestors were pulling straight off a tree. Here's where the story turns considerably darker. When plants weren't enough, ancient humans went much further. In 2018, researchers studying a Neolithic skull unearthed in Spain made a discovery that genuinely rattled the medical world. The skull, roughly 5,000 years old, had been deliberately cut open, not by injury, but by a human hand wielding a stone tool. And crucially, it showed clear signs of healing, meaning the patient survived the procedure. This practice is called trepanation, the oldest known surgical procedure in human history, and it's turned up on every single inhabited continent. Skulls with deliberately cut openings, some healed, some not, have been found in Peru, France, Russia, China, and across Africa, with the oldest known examples over 7,000 years old. What exactly were they treating? Researchers believe it was likely used for severe headaches, seizures, mental illness, and skull fractures. Essentially, anything that seemed connected to the head. The underlying logic, that something inside the skull was causing the problem, and that opening it up might relieve that pressure. Was ancient humans reverse engineering a problem they couldn't actually see? And the survival rate wasn't negligible at all. Studies of Neolithic trepanned skulls suggest somewhere between 50% and 90% of patients survived, based on visible bone regrowth around the edges of the cuts. These weren't botched, desperate attempts. They were practiced, refined procedures passed down deliberately across generations. Someone had to be in charge of all this specialized knowledge. Someone who knew exactly which plant to use, precisely how to cut a skull, and when each intervention was appropriate. That person was the shaman. In virtually every hunter-gatherer society anthropologists have ever studied, there's a single figure sitting right at the intersection of medicine and the supernatural: the shaman, healer, or medicine person, depending on the specific culture. And this figure was arguably the single most critical specialist in the entire group. Where a skilled hunter's knowledge might keep the tribe fed for a week, the shaman's knowledge could keep them alive for an entire generation. A 2021 study published in PLOS Own analyzed grave sites from the Natufian culture in the eastern Mediterranean, dating back roughly 12,000 years, and one particular burial stood out sharply from the rest. The body belonged to a woman in her 40s, buried alongside the remains of more than 50 tortoise shells, parts of an eagle, a leopard, a wild boar, a cow, and even a human foot. Researchers concluded she was almost certainly a shaman. The most elaborately, carefully buried individual at the entire site was the community's healer. These people weren't simply mixing herbs together at random. They functioned as the living memory of their entire community, carrying accumulated medical knowledge from dozens of generations, passed down through direct practice, oral story, and ritual. Lose the shaman, and a tribe effectively lost its entire medical library in a single death. And then there's fever. Modern medicine, for decades, tried to aggressively suppress fever. Ice baths, medication designed to drive the temperature straight down. It turns out that instinct was largely wrong. Fever isn't your body malfunctioning. It's your immune system deliberately turning up the internal heat to kill off pathogens that simply can't survive above a certain temperature. Ancient humans seem to have understood this intuitively, long before they had any scientific vocabulary for it. Ethnographic studies of living hunter-gatherer groups reveal a strikingly consistent pattern. When someone develops a fever, they're typically moved closer to the fire and kept warm, not cooled down. Their bodies are allowed to run hot. It's only within the last century that modern medicine actually uncovered the immunological mechanism, explaining why that instinct was right all along. Your ancestors never had germ theory. But roughly 300,000 years of dying from infection taught them, empirically, exactly what worked. Knowledge encoded not in any book, but directly in behavior passed down through observation. Here's what makes all of this quietly devastating to sit with. Researchers estimate that roughly 25% of children in ancient hunter-gatherer societies died before reaching age 5, overwhelmingly from infection and disease. And despite that brutal mortality rate, the species survived anyway. Because of the birch mushroom and the willow bark, because of the shaman and the trepanation, because of a tribe in Shanidar Cave that simply refused to abandon a man with no arm and failing eyesight. The next time you swallow an aspirin, you're completing a line stretching back roughly 50,000 years, back to someone crouched in a cave, chewing on tree bark, with no idea why it helped, only the accumulated certainty that it did. We didn't invent medicine. We inherited it, and the overwhelming majority of this knowledge was discovered by pure accident. No laboratories, no clinical trials, no understanding whatsoever of bacteria or viruses. Just human beings trapped in a brutal, repeating cycle. Someone gets sick, someone tries something. Most of the time, it failed. Occasionally, it didn't. And whenever it worked, that piece of information outlived the person who first stumbled onto it. That's what medicine originally was. Not science in the modern sense, but memory. Even today, humanity is still constantly testing, observing, adjusting, and passing knowledge forward. The only real difference now is that the experiments happen behind white walls, wrapped in scientific language. Underneath all of it, it's still the exact same species, still trying to survive long enough to understand itself.